khalilandani.com if you have any other questions or just want to know more about him.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you all for joining us this evening. A special thank you to the Harvard Islamic Society and to Layla and the president and really the whole executive for putting this on. This notion of diversity in Islam is something that we all are familiar with in theory, but it seems a bit more difficult to put that into practice. And I would just say that what Harvard Islamic Society has done in the past, which I was a part of, and what they're doing this week is a very nice, forward-thinking approach to this issue. So I guess my talk is the first of 4 talks trying to showcase some aspect of the diversity of Islam. And I'll be speaking about Shii Ismaili Islam, otherwise known as Ismailism, but as you'll see, it's much more accurate to describe it this way as opposed to an ism. Why is that? Well, I'm sure some of you are aware that there's a tendency for all of us, Muslim and non-Muslim, to speak of minority branches of Islam as sects, for example, or schisms. And we tend to give these minority groups their own ism. So we hear about Sufism and Shi'ism and Ismailism and whatnot. We rarely hear about Sunnism, though. A few people may say it, but you'll never hear about the Sunni sect. And this is just a tendency, and it's not really something that Muslims do alone. It really comes out of European scholarship, where what tends to happen is the various diverse branches and ideals within Islam are often portrayed sort of as sects. And that idea of sect is coming from European interpretations of Christianity. And that assumes, when we talk about sects, it assumes that there is something called a church, that there's a main body of Islam called the church, and everybody, specific groups like Shi'is, Ismailis, and whoever split off from the main group Muslim church. Now the problem with this is there is no main body Muslim group. What you do have is what pre-modern Muslim thinkers called firaq, singular firqa. The term firqa, of course, doesn't really mean a sect. Rather, firqa is a particular group with a particular way of interpreting Islam and the beliefs and practices of Islam. So we can't really talk about sects, and I'm not going to use that term. I prefer to call all this diversity that you see here communities of interpretation. And as you can see, what we call the Ismailis, they are a particular set of communities within the general Shia branch. And even among Sunnis, you have different communities and different affiliations. Some are classically grounded and some are modern grounded. And even if you go apart from these sort of, in the blue boxes, when you look here, you have so many Kalam schools and you have so many Sufi tariqas. So I would propose to you, and you don't have to agree with me, but I think it's better that we stop talking about one Islam and we instead talk about many Islams. We acknowledge that there are in fact different and mutually competing ideas of what is Islam, consisting of both belief, theology, and practice, and that these are different. And my proposal to you is that each of these that you see here, whether it's a particular form of Sufi Islam, whether it's a particular form of Ismaili Islam, or what have you, we have to appreciate each of these as an integral, complete form of Islam unto itself. And remember, understanding is not believing, right? Just because you understand another group's point of view really well, it doesn't mean you believe them to be true. And sometimes it's very easy to, confuse understanding and actually accepting something. So I think the goal should be understanding. So I hope to help you do that today. And as I said, I'm going to be talking about the Ismailis, and that's what I was asked to do. And I'm going to present for about 40 minutes or so, and then at the end of my presentation, I have a short video clip to show you. And following that, I am at your disposal for whatever questions you want to ask. And you can be honest with your questions. I know there's a lot of misconceptions about Ismailis, and people have heard different things about Ismailis, and don't be shy to ask. Like, I won't get offended or anything like that. Some of you may know there's a whole course on Ismaili history and thought at Harvard taking place right now. It takes place every 2-3 years. So it is a subject that has been and is studied academically as well. So what we call Shii Ismaili Islam has its roots and really is a part of Shii Islam, or otherwise called Shia Islam. And the whole notion of Shia Islam is based on a particular interpretation of authority and history. Again, it is a particular interpretation of authority and history. And the notion of authority that Shia Muslims look back to is, of course, rooted in the very authority of the Prophet Muhammad. And when we look at the Quran, not just as a scripture, but as a historical document, as something that can sort of tell us who the historical Prophet Muhammad was, we find various types of authority invested by the Quran in the Prophet Muhammad. So on one hand, Prophet Muhammad was a messenger of God. He was a warner, a bringer of glad tidings, as the Quran calls him. So you have that notion of authority, where he's transmitting a message. But you also have this idea, also in the Quran, primarily in the Medinan verses, where the Prophet Muhammad actually carries the authority of God on earth. And many verses testify to this when it talks about, for example, he who obeys the Prophet obeys God, for example, and other things like that. You also have this idea that the Prophet Muhammad, in addition to conveying God's message, conveying revelation, was also the person who interpreted that revelation and who taught it and who explained it. So in other words, and most Muslims would agree with me when I say, the Quran does not present the Prophet Muhammad as merely a fax machine for the Quran. There are some people who believe this, but I would respectfully disagree as a historian. And I would say that the Quran endows Muhammad with a maximal degree of authority that is extra Quranic. So it goes beyond just sort of reciting the Quran, right? And finally, within the Quran, and although it's a controversial point today, but I know mainstream Sunni scholars, affirm this, and of course all the Shia affirm this. The Prophet Muhammad is an intercessor. There are several Quranic verses that talk about Muhammad praying for the believers, asking God for the forgiveness of the believers, purifying the believers, and so on. Muhammad accepts offerings when people want to offer atonement for their sins, for example. That's also in the Quran. So Muhammad is a mediator between the believers and God. And of course, there's a legitimate debate over whether that continues after his death or not, but certainly when his lifetime he is. Now, I'm highlighting all this because this is all going on when the Quran is not yet a book. The Quran is a live recitation event when the Prophet Muhammad is alive. It's not a scripture yet. And of course, as we saw, Muhammad has extra Quranic authority, i.e. his function goes beyond just reciting the Quran. So what we're dealing with is what some scholars, like William Graham, call the prophetic-revelatory event, where the phenomenon of revelation, when Muhammad was alive, does not come as a scripture, but it comes as an entire event, and the person of Muhammad is in the middle of that. Now, I'm highlighting this because upon the death of Muhammad, you had someone who had all this authority, and of course this raises questions about what happens to that authority. Because you have somebody here, historically, who claims to be effectively the representative of God on earth. So what should happen when he passes away? And this, of course, leads to the first manifestations of what we call the Shia, the Shi'at Ali. Early on, during the very lifetime of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, there is a group who revere him as the successor or wasi of Muhammad, and as the one who rightfully carries all of Muhammad's spiritual and religious authority. Now, Ali is not a prophet, he's not bringing a new revelation, but basically all those extra Quranic roles of Muhammad would be carried on by Ali. And the term that the earliest sources give to that belief or that idea is walaya. So that's how the Shii would often describe this allegiance to Ali through the term walaya. And this is a religious and a political authority. Remember, at that time, this is like before, European modern thought, where like the secular and the religious have been separated. At that time, what we call political and religious are pretty intertwined. So we can't say that, this Shia thing is just a political dispute, why don't they get over it? Which is what a lot of people say, especially in the media, right? They present the Shia-Sunni thing as just about politics, and why can't they get past that? But it's not simply about politics. It is a dispute about spiritual authority as well, because they're intertwined. Now, why would anybody even think this? Where does this idea come from, historically speaking? One part of it comes from the pre-Islamic Arabian tribal custom, where clan authority was hereditary, generally speaking. Another part of this seems to come out of the Quran itself, where the Quran often describes many of the past prophets and messengers of God as being lineal descendants and members of the same family, and in many cases, prophets are succeeded by either their blood family or their descendants. And I've just put a few things on the slide. But this fact, coming from the Quran, has been documented by scholars such as Wilfred Madelung and Muhammad Ali Amer Moezi in recent times. So what I'm saying is, if we're asking, well, where would this idea come from of Muhammad succeeded by his family, one part of it seems to be the Quranic narrative about past prophets. There's, of course, the Quranic notion of Muhammad's own family, known as the Ahl al-Bayt, and both Sunnis and Shii Muslims today, affirm the importance of the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of Muhammad, of whom Ali is included. So that's not a very controversial point, but it can be interpreted in different ways. So again, this is part of that background. Then there's also certain statements that the Shii Muslims would point to from the biography of Muhammad that they have interpreted to indicate Ali's appointment by the Prophet as his successor. One of them comes from the earliest seerah of Ibn Ishaq, which has been in the recension of Ibn Hisham, where Muhammad, apparently appoints Ali as his successor at the beginning of his mission, when Ali is about 10 years old. And you're all familiar with the declaration of Ghadir Qum, where Muhammad said, in the presence of Ali and others, "He whose Mawla I am, Ali is his Mawla." And of course, there is a legitimate disagreement among Muslims over what this really means, and what is the sort of scope of authority that's contained in the term Mawla. Does it mean master or lord? Does it mean friend? Does it mean intimate? And that's a whole sort of can of worms that maybe some of you are familiar with. And of course, there's the famous Hadith al-Thaqalain, which we find in many, it's a widely attested tradition in Sunni Hadith books as well, where the Prophet said he was leaving behind Kitab Allah, which really generically means divine guidance, because the Quran at this time is not actually a book. But the Prophet says he's leaving behind Kitab Allah and his Ahl al-Bayt, which includes Ali as well as Ali's sons, Hassan and Hussein. So this, of course, is just to show you the basis and what Shii Muslims would sort of draw on to think about these issues. And of course, like any text, they have been interpreted within the Sunni tradition in somewhat different ways. And that, of course, is a legitimate disagreement to have. So what happens then is on the Shia side, and again, a group called the Shi'at Ali already exists in the 1st century. Meanwhile, what we later call the Sunni notion of authority, where the caliphs are the political authorities, the ulama are the religious authorities, and the Sufi sheikhs shuyukh are the spiritual authorities. This arrangement that you see here, that takes about 5 centuries to get to. I'm sure some of you may be aware that the idea of the 4 Sunni madhabs being equally legitimate, is really something that takes hold with the Mamluks in the 13th century, where the Mamluks appointed 4 chief qadis, 1 of each madhab, and that's how it started. So the point is, these models take some time. On the Shii side, already in the 1st century, you definitely have a group of people who are tracing Ali's authority, called the Imama or Imamate, through descendants of Ali. And the idea here was that Ali appointed his sons, and Ali's son Hussein appointed his son Zayn al-Abidin. Zayn al-Abidin appointed Muhammad al-Baqir. Muhammad al-Baqir appointed Ja'far Sadiq. So there's a belief among the Shia, most Shia, that the legitimate imam will appoint the next imam, and that appointment is a sort of divine decree over leadership, just as the Prophet is believed by the Shia to have appointed Ali. Now, this theory of imama by appointment runs into some issues, because upon the death of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, 2 different sons are claiming to be the imam. That leads to a schism, and the group that follows the younger son, Musa Kazim, they become later known as the Twelvers, the Ithna Ashari. Why? Because the line of Musa Kazim goes up to 12 imams. And this group, the Ithna Ashari, believe that the imam currently is this 12th imam, and he disappeared in 874. The 9th century. So that's the Ithnashri group who are following this side. But another group, who was a minority, followed Ismail, the son of Ja'far Sadiq, and Ismail's descendants as their imams. And the imam of that group, the 11th imam of that group, he took on the title al-Mahdi as well, and he founded the Fatimid Caliphate. And the Fatimid Caliphate, of course, competed with the Abbasid Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate over the whole political contestation of who are the rightful caliphs of the Muslim world. So the Ismailis are following a visible line of imams, while the Twelvers would follow a hidden imam. And that's how the 2 groups are different. And that visible line of imama for Ismailis continues during the Fatimid Caliphate. So the Fatimid Caliph is also the Ismaili imam during this time period. And that, of course, is very interesting politically, because the political and the spiritual head are the same. And you can imagine what sort of a political situation that could lead to, where you could have parties who are trying to sort of co-opt different parts of that authority. And actually what you have is, upon the death of the Fatimid Caliph and Imam al-Mustansir Billah, there's another schism. And this schism was actually somewhat politically motivated, because the Fatimid vizier at that time preferred one particular son over the other. And that's what led to this schism. So the younger son's name was Musta'ali. He was put on the throne by the Fatimid vizier, whereas the agreed heir apparent or heir designate was another son named Nizar. So those who followed Musta'ali, they became known as the Tayyibi Ismailis, and for them, within 2 generations of Musta'ali, their line of imam is believed to be gone into hiding in the mid-1200s. So for the Tayyibis, they are divided into 3 different communities called Boras: Dawoodi Boras, Sulaimani Boras, and Alavi Boras. And each of these communities claims that a chief missionary, known as the Dai Mutlaq, is the one who speaks or represents their hidden imams. Now, on the other side of it, the group that followed Nizar, they became known as the Nizari Ismailis, and they followed a line of imams descended from Nizar. So this is, again, a father-son succession. And that line, it did go into hiding, i.e., they had to sort of protect themselves from persecution, because at this time, the various dynasties, the Abbasids, the Mamluks, later the Safavids, the Mongols especially, all these dynasties are trying to exterminate the Nizari line of imams. as well as the Nizari Ismailis themselves. And there was the equivalent of a genocide committed by the Mongols in the 13th century, where some scholars estimate maybe about 100,000 Nizari Ismailis were executed or killed during that time. So the community had to practice taqiyya for about 500 years. And what that means is that the Nizari Ismailis would have to conceal their Ismaili belief and identity. They would have to outwardly present themselves as Sunnis or as certain types of Sufis, as Ithnashris, and in some cases as what we later call Hindus. And this was a survival technique. So they did this, but what happens is around the, now we're talking in the 19th century, the political situation starts to shift a little bit. And the 46th Imam, who's this Hasan Ali Shah, who himself, again, descended from Nizar, who's descended from all the way back. So Hasan Ali Shah, the Nizari Ismaili Imam, moves to India. India is controlled by the British at this time. And as bad as colonialism, British colonialism really is, it was not as bad for minority groups. So there are a lot of Shia-type groups in India who the Mughals would have persecuted and killed, but under colonial India, they were allowed to do a bit better. So he's being persecuted, Hasan Ali Shah Aga Khan, he's being persecuted in Iran, so he only finds refuge in India. And there's a whole Nizari Ismaili community in India. So it's during that period that the Nizari Imams become prominent. They're given the title Aga Khan by one of the Persian monarchs before the Qajar sort of went against them. So now they carry the family title Aga Khan, and it's only 4 generations old. So then Aga Khan the first is Hasan Ali Shah. His son is Aga Khan the second, named Ali Shah. Then his son is Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan the third. That's the 48th Imam. And his grandson is Karim al-Husseini Aga Khan the fourth, the 49th Imam. So that's about 49 Imams, and believe it or not, every Nizari Ismaili today has memorized that list by heart. So if you talk to them, they'll be able to recite from Ali ibn Abi Talib all the way to Shah Karim al-Husseini. That's their list of Imams. It's longer than a 12 Imam list, right? So you need more memorization. But there you go. Some things to just highlight. The 48th Imam, Aga Khan III, he's actually a very important figure internationally. A lot of people don't know this. So he became the Imam when he was 8. His father died when he was 8. So just imagine, you have few million, we don't know the exact number of Nizari Ismailis, but you have a few million, maybe 10 million Nizari Ismailis, and they're following an 8-year-old. So this 8-year-old Imam would go up in front of a crowd of thousands and start giving religious guidance to them. And we actually have his guidance transcribed. So it's something that could be studied historically if one wanted to. So and this, of course, he became the Imam in 1885. So this is an interesting time. And it's also an interesting case study of sort of like how does a community deal with having a visible Imam, right? And what are the challenges that could bring. What's also important about Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III is he is very much a Muslim modernist thinker. So for those who study South Asian Muslim modernists, people like Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Sayyid Amir Ali, Aga Khan III is part of that circle. Muhammad Iqbal as well. He's part of that circle. And what he's doing in his time, and he's trying to advocate for the Indian Muslims to deal with the British. He's also advocating for Muslims worldwide. So when World War I ended, Turkey was initially given a really bad deal, like peace terms. And it's actually Aga Khan III who intervened with the Allies to make sure Turkey got a better peace deal. And he was successful in that. He also was India's delegate to the League of Nations, and in 1937, 1938, he became president of the League of Nations. Now, they don't usually tell you that in 1937, a Muslim was president of the League of Nations. But in today's age of Islamophobia it is worth noting that, right? So Muslims have been part of like what we call the West, perhaps we incorrectly call it the West, but Muslims have been part of that for a very long time, right? And this is just one example. For those who are aware, Aga Khan III was also one of the sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say founding fathers, but one of the key contributors to the founding of Pakistan. So he worked alongside Jinnah, for example, in the Muslim independence movement. Now, he died in 1957, and he appointed in his will to be the next Imam his grandson. And his grandson was a sophomore at Harvard. And that's him, right here. This is Shah Karim al-Husseini Aga Khan IV. He becomes the Imam of 10 to 15 million Ismailis while he's an undergraduate at Harvard. And here he's back at Harvard getting an honorary degree in 2008. This is in the 60s. He's meeting with President Kennedy. And this is, of course, a much more recent picture from one of his visits. So this is the present Imam, the living Imam for the Nizari Ismailis. He's the 49th Imam. They call him Hazar Imam, which literally means the present Imam. And he's also the chairman of the Aga Khan Development Network. This is the largest array of privately owned development agencies, and I'll talk about them. In a moment. One thing about the current Aga Khan is that he has really interpreted Islam to be a thinking, spiritual, logical faith. And it's something he's been advancing in his guidance both to the public and to the Ismaili community. So he often talks about faith and intellect being intertwined, about the use of intellect being necessary to understand the existence of God and to interpret Islam and these sort of things. One of his key message, if you had to pick one we're talking about hundreds of speeches over the last 60 years, is pluralism. So the Aga Khan started talking about pluralism during the 90s, where everybody thought that, yeah, we know diversity, it's obvious, right? Like, we don't question this. But he started talking about this in the 90s, and he kept talking about it. And in my opinion, it's only in this time where ethno-fascism and all sorts of form of bigotry are on the rise. It's now where we can really appreciate like what the notion of pluralism is, and perhaps why it's actually quite relevant to our current situation. So he established a global center for pluralism in Canada, and there are various initiatives where he's trying to talk about pluralism, both within the Ummah and pluralism of humanity across the globe. He has been widely recognized. We're talking a lot of honorary degrees, state, national government recognition, keynote addresses, civic honors. This is all documented, so you can find a listing of all these online at a website called Ismaili Mail. But this is quite well documented, and you could look this up if you wanted to. I'm stressing this again to emphasize the idea of Muslims today are making important contributions to human progress, and it's right before us. And that idea is something that really has to be more emphasized in the current climate. And this is just the example I'm using. We know there are other Muslim foundations and figures who are doing this sort of work too. I mentioned the Aga Khan Development Network. So are people here, anyone from like Pakistan? So you're familiar with Aga Khan University and Aga Khan Hospital, right? And so that institution is part of this wider array of agencies. So there's an Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, an Islamic Art Museum. There's Aga Khan Trust for Culture. They restore all these old mosques and even non-Muslim architecture. There's Aga Khan Academies, which are like which are high schools that teach the IB program. So you have all these Aga Khan institutions, Aga Khan Health Services, and they've had a major impact. So these institutions spend about $900 million a year annually on economic development, healthcare, art, architecture, health, education, social services, and so on. And most of the beneficiaries are not Ismaili Muslims. And most of the work is done in Asia and Africa. Now the interesting thing is that this work that you see documented here, it's done in the name of Islam. So there's a document online that explains sort of the philosophy of the Aga Khan Development Network, and the whole document is about the ethics of Islam, and the Quran and the Hadith are quoted throughout that document. So this work it's all about improving human well-being, quality of life, but it's done in the name of Islam, so it's not seen as philanthropy, which is what we often call this sort of work. This is not philanthropy that you do on the side in addition to being a Muslim, but rather this sort of work is articulated as part of being a Muslim. So it comes out of this idea about deen and dunya, faith and world, and how to join them. So the next time somebody talks about extremism or violence and says, oh, well, that violence is Islamic, well, we should point out that there are other institutions like the AKDN, as well as the Ely Foundation in Pakistan, and their work is just as Islamic, if you're going to make that argument. Right? Like, if simply grounding something in the Quran or the Hadith or the general belief in Islam makes something Islamic, then we should all be consistent and also talk about this type of work, which is also Islamic. And you could all probably think of other examples, even in this country, where Muslims are doing civic action in the name of Islam. Right? So, I'm going to talk a little bit about theology now. I want to give you I've talked about history and I've talked about where the Ismailis have come from and what they're doing now, but there's a theology behind this, and that theology is not well understood, so I'm going to try to summarize a few things for you, and if something is not clear, you can ask me in question period about that. So,